Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Explain Apologetics. This is a gospel-centered apologetic ministry which take pains to be faithful to the scripture in our defense of the faith. Now, I believe it was in October the 6th, 1536, an Englishman was strangled and burned at the stake in a small town in Belgium. His crime, translating the Bible into his native language, English. Now, while that was a crime back then, we've had since, as of October last year in 2019, I believe we've had close to 700 translations, the Bible has been translated to at least 700 different languages, and I believe the New Testament alone is more than 1,500 languages. We've had many translations since, but to have the Bible in your own language, your native language, was a privilege that most people didn't have back in the day. Joining us today in Explain Apologetics, a special interview, we have Dr. Don Wilkins, who is the senior translator for the New American Study Bible. Dr. Don Wilkins has worked on the NASB. He is the scholar in residence at the Lockman Foundation. And just a note on his PhD, it was in ancient Greek and in Latin from UCLA. It's a joy to have you with us, Dr. Don Wilkins.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Indeed.
I'm, of course, speaking from the United States and California, where we are under a stay-at-home order. So we're all a little ragged from being cooped up at home. Although I'm in the mountains, I'm privileged to live up here and work at home. So it's not too bad.
It's not too bad, yeah. So it's kind of the same thing here where I am in Texas as well. And I guess the reason we had to, this is actually a pre-recorded interview. We wanted to do it live stream, but due to the unstable internet connection, we've had this pre-recorded, and we're just going to put this, post this onto our YouTube channel in a couple of hours' time. But once again, really great to have Dr. Don Wilkins with us. We face a lot of questions, Dr. Wilkins, with regards to translations. And I guess that most people have questions on translations. And I guess let's start with the most obvious one. How on earth does a translation work? Because in many people's mind, it often seems as if one guy just takes the Bible and says, I'm going to say this in what language I want to, and try and sell it. If you could just give us a brief run through as to the translation process as well, the whole process, that would be great.
Yeah, well, today, you have to forgive me, I'm also a little under the weather, but today, translations are usually done by a committee or a team of translators, and often under a general editor overseeing the project. Usually, various books of the Bible will be assigned to the team of translators, and one person will say the translator will do his work on the book, and then when he's finished with that, it'll go to other translators to evaluate it and to go over it. Sometimes also just general readers who are part of the organization, and when they critique it, they may hand it back to him to do some revision work on that, and then that process will be repeated. It'll go back to the translators, other translators in the organization, who will critique it to more, and then when they're finally happy with that, believe it or not, that may go out to other readers in the organization, and when people are happy with that, they may, the organization, the people who are overseeing the whole process, will send it out possibly to selected readers in the general public to look at it, and they'll send it back and say what they think about it. And if there's a general editor involved, he may go over it, he or she may go over it and see what they think. And so the whole process is pretty complicated now. And hopefully you don't get back something that looks like it was put together by a committee, you know. It be the response to that. The other way to do it is to maybe have one person do the whole thing. That's kind of what was done with the Message. I think Eugene Peterson was the one who did the Message, but that wasn't really a translation at all. That was a paraphrase, and he said so. I think a long time ago there was a paraphrase called the Phillips translation, and I think J.B. Phillips did the whole thing. So you get consistency when there's just one person working on it, but if you just have one person doing the whole thing, then you're going to have all the mistakes that one person can make. So if you have a team working on it, especially a team of scholars, you're going to have people who are kind of overseeing the process and checking each other and avoiding mistakes that would be made by one person. So I think a team is better, and having some control over that team and cross-checking each other, so that's really the way it's done now most of the time. That's how we do it,
Right. Just before that's just a lot to unpack right there. But before we do that, could you just share with us, especially your interest coming in from someone who's done your PhD in ancient Greek and in Latin? What drove your interest in biblical languages?
Well, it actually started with church. I had a pastor who he wasn't a Greek major or anything like that in seminary, but he did go to seminary, and he used to mention the Greek very often in his sermons, and I was fascinated by that, and I ended up going to seminary and studying New Testament Greek in seminary, and I really wasn't a very good student. In foreign languages, I took French in high school and barely passed it. I'm very, very, very poor at it, really. But I just Greek for some reason, and I went to seminary not so much to become a pastor or anything like that, but just because I wanted to learn more about the Bible and to really immerse myself in New Testament Greek in particular. And while I was there, I also learned as much Hebrew as I possibly could, and I was privileged to study under Charles Feinberg, who was a master in Hebrew and Aramaic and really a number of Semitic languages. So I wouldn't say I mastered Hebrew there. Since I've learned a lot of, I've studied Hebrew a lot and worked in it a lot, and in Aramaic and done a great deal of research in that as well. So that's how I got into it. And since I was really a glutton for punishment, went on to do my PhD in Greek and Latin too. So that's what got me started, really, was a pastor who used Greek and talked about it a lot in the sermons.
Oh, that's interesting. So just to go a little bit further, because we did an overview of what the translation process was, but before you actually get into the translation process, you'd have to go through and basically decide on which manuscripts you're going to use, because there are tons of manuscripts out there. How does that, if you could just briefly explain to us what the manuscript, the textual criticism is, just a brief run through, and how do you guys decide what to go with?
Yeah, we are in a brand new phase of textual criticism now. We used to, as textual, translators now, I think, have to become textual critics, which the word criticism can sound really terrible to the general public. It sounds like you're critiquing the Bible or criticizing a text, and that's not it at all. Criticism means you're trying to analyze the alternate readings that are in these thousands of manuscripts. And let me just explain what that sounds like. If we had the original manuscripts, and I'm talking about the autographs, the original manuscripts that Paul and Peter and Matthew wrote, which of course we don't. They've long since perished, unfortunately. and all we have is these copies, but we have thousands and thousands of copies now, you know, that have survived, only they're all handwritten, right? If I somehow, if you go to Washington, D.C. and buy a copy of the Declaration of Independence, what you bought is a printed copy of it, right? And I could take that printed copy, which is fairly reliable, you know, because we have somewhere in the archives in Washington, we have the original text, I think, of the Declaration of Independence, and printing presses have made copies of those. I can take that copy home and run off 100 copies of that on my photocopy machine, and every one of those copies will be an accurate copy of the one I bought in Washington, D.C., right? So I don't have to worry about those copies being somehow corrupt. They're all just as good as the copy I bought in Washington, right? But suppose I hand wrote copies of, or hand copied copies of those instead, running out of my printer. Well, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't be sure that those copies would be accurate. So that's what we're dealing with. We've got all these thousands of copies that have little variations, and we have to try to figure out, you know, what the original copy is from all these alternate readings. When we started analyzing all these copies, as I said, you and I were talking earlier, in the late 19th century, we discovered some very ancient copies that were not around when the King James text was done, and these copies go back to the 4th century AD, which is very, very early compared to some of the copies that we have of classical texts. And we've got papyri that go back way earlier than that, even to the 2nd century, you know, that basically back up some of these 4th century copies. So we have these wonderful texts, and we used to be able to just basically depend upon a couple of these earliest copies, and basically two things were involved. One was in textual criticism and deciding what the original copies are, the early date of these manuscripts, and deciding what the reading is based upon the likelihood that it is the original reading. And the likelihood, and I don't want to overcomplicate it, you know, for listeners, but if you find, let's say you find two readings, and one is an easy, what we call an easy reading, one that makes perfect sense, and one that is a little harder to understand, one that, well, one is a little harder to understand than the other, let's say. And you know that one has been changed. They can't both be, you know, right, because one is different from the other, okay? Which would you say is most likely to be the original reading? Or which, that's a question. And which is the one that is most likely to have been changed, all right? Now put on your detective hat. If the one that is most likely to have been changed would be not the one that is the easier reading, because if I'm a smart guy, right, then I'm not going to change one that makes sense into something that doesn't make sense or makes less sense, right? So I'm most likely to change the reading that makes less sense into something that makes more sense, right?
Okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So my task is to find the original reading, figure out the original reading. So I don't really want a reading that has been changed into something easier. If I'm looking for the original reading, I want the reading that is most likely to have been changed, right? That's most likely to have been the original reading.
Right.
You follow me?
Yeah. And I guess a case in point would be John chapter 1, verse 18. where it says that for no man has seen God, the only begotten Son, I think is what it says in the King James Version. But I guess NA28 has says the only begotten God is supposed to be the more
Yeah,
accurate reading.
that doesn't make quite as much sense. You can understand it, but it seems like only begotten Son would be more natural. Right. So, but what we want is the original reading that most likely was changed to something else. Right. So that's the kind of thing we're after. And especially if you find a manuscript that not only has the reading that was most likely changed, but is also the older manuscript, that's most likely the original reading. All right.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing a textual critic does. He or she tries to determine the reading that was most likely the original reading, and it's most likely the one that is both older and is more likely to have been changed to something else. And we call that the harder reading of the two. Just not a very classy name for it, but it's, we call it the harder reading. So that's what we're after. We're looking for those kinds of manuscripts that are both older and harder. And there's been a new thing coming up. It's called the concordance-based genealogical method. Now, I've also had to indoctrinate myself in that. What that does is, and it's way too complicated you could have 3 or 4 shows on that, actually,
right.
To be truthful about it. And I'm actually writing a book about that too, as we speak. But that goes around, kind of takes a run around the dating issue, and it tries to evaluate manuscripts not so much by age, but by building a family tree based upon resemblances between manuscripts. In some ways, it's very simple. It's kind of a mathematical thing, where you're actually counting resemblances between readings within manuscripts, and you're trying to match them up genetically, so to speak, or genealogically by mathematically counting the numbers of resemblances they have within these readings. And you're doing that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're also evaluating these harder readings against the easier readings and trying to figure out which manuscripts are the ancestors and descendants of other manuscripts by pairing them one manuscript against another manuscript. And it's a very elaborate system based upon not thousands of manuscripts, but pairing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts, and ignoring the age of the paper they're written on, literally, or the parchment and papyrus they're written on, quite literally. So that basically ignores the physical dating of the material they're written on and just looks at the text. So that's another system, and we've done that, and we've taken that into account with the NASB 2020, and that hasn't had too great an effect really on analyzing the readings, but it has had some effect. So I've done that too.
Right.
So
NA20.
that's another of evaluating the manuscripts.
Right.
So that's another issue, the CBGM.
Right. So the NA 2020, NASB 2020 edition, I understand from Dr. Don Wilkins, will be coming out later this year, I believe, right? If all goes well. Right. So because there's been a lot of talk on the internet that says, well, the NASB is one of those translations that doesn't improve. It's just going to be the NASB, unlike the ESV, which keeps revising. But well, the news is end of this year we will be having NASB 2020. But I just want to go back to what you were just saying just now, Dr. Wilkins, on going back to the more difficult reading. So it's not as if that you guys at the NASB or the ESV or the NIV just decided to hide a bunch of verses from the rest of the public because you guys are, you know, trying to mess with the scripture. Because back in the day, and this was at least 20 years ago, I mentioned to you before that, you know, you were in the John Ankerberg Show dealing with the King James only controversy, where I remember and I remember you had your cough there was the cough heard around the world because so James White has
well, that was something.
James White and Sam Gibb have been going at each other. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, James White, a Reformed apologist, has written a book called The King James Only Controversy. And he was with Dr. Don Wilkins in the John Ankerberg Show, where they, together with translators from the NIV and the NKJV, dealt with the King James Onlyists. I'm not sure if Ruckman was there, but I remember Sam Gibb was there back then. So, and the charge made against all of you is that the New World Translation and the NASB, according to one of them, I think, said it was the NASB, not the NASB. Leave that aside. That you guys were basically taking out verses like John chapter 5, verse 4, verses like the Johannine comma, 1 John 5:7, the longer reading of that. So it's not as if you're doing that, right? Just for the reader, just for the viewers to be clear, you're not doing that. You're just going back to the text and to see what the manuscripts say.
No, it was never there to begin with. It was added there. Yeah, Erasmus added that on a dare, basically. It was from the Latin. It was from the Vulgate that he added that there, and oh, that show was something. I guess you have to forgive me. I do have a cough that I developed earlier this year, and but I got a frog in my throat. I just got a little blip there. I did get a frog in my throat, and I made the mistake of making a joke about having lost my voice. And James White told me, "Oh, you should never have said that because they're going to make a huge thing about that," and they did. And oh, brother. Apparently, they had John Ankerberg had a recording of that of me doing that, and he edited it out, and he should never have done that, because if he just let the thing run and showed what had happened to me, it would have been nothing, you know. But they made a huge thing about that, you know. And I was going to do a YouTube video to just counter show it, but it wouldn't matter because they would have still made a huge deal about it anyway. So, you know, at least, well, here I am. I never did lose my voice, by the way, and I still haven't lost my voice. So, what can I say? But that was amazing. Yeah, you know, one thing about that show, I couldn't believe, but it is kind of interesting about relative to what we're talking about. They believe, and I think they still do, the King James people believe that at least these guys did, that the King James translation is more reliable than the original manuscripts from which it was translated. They believe that it's more reliable than the original Greek and Hebrew from which it was translated. And so they believe their job, or they did back then, one of their jobs is to teach people King James English so that they can understand and read the King James.
Right. Okay.
That.
Right.
That defies all logic to me, but I mean, wow, you know, what do you say to that? I
it's
don't
hard
know.
to it's going to be hard to say anything. Particularly, you've got to have to learn how it was said back in King James. But going back to
Yeah.
the manuscript, so we've discussed that basically what you're saying is we're looking through a bunch of manuscripts. We're trying to determine what was originally said. We're not taking out a bunch of
Yes.
verses. And I understand that the NASB, which you were the senior translator of, took pains to actually italicize, I can't pronounce that word correctly, words that were not there, words that you kind of added on in order to make sense of the sentence. Is that true? And could you just...
got the italic in there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's something else. You mentioned the NIV earlier. That's a good comparison. We do have, if you know the NASB, we have italic in the NASB. We always have had. I'm not sure, and I want to be honest. I want to be fair and objective about it, because I know that not everybody is going to use the NASB, and nor should they. I mean, if the NASB doesn't work for you, you should use a Bible that does. But and I'm not sure I like italic for words that are added to smooth out the text. There are a lot of other things that could be done. And, you could have words in brackets, you could have words in, other kinds of typefaces, because we have all kinds of different options today, but we've always, in the NASB, traditionally, we've used italic for words that are not in the text, that are there to smooth out the text. But at least we do have that, We've added, we have italic to smooth out the text there. And what that represents in the NASB is words that have been added that we feel that are either implied by the Greek or Hebrew, but are added by the translator, to let you know that if you looked at the Greek or Hebrew, they're not exactly there in the text. Sometimes they represent a grammatical construction that's being interpreted by the translator. For example, the Greek imperfect tense, which has a lot of different ways it can be translated. We have the word sometimes begin to do something. And that's not the only way you could translate the Greek imperfect. Like was doing something is a way to translate it. But sometimes we translate the Greek imperfect as begin to do something, which is a legitimate way to do it. The context may call for it, but there's also a Greek word that means begin to do something. So if the Greek imperfect is there, we may have the word begin in italic to let the reader know that the Greek word for begin is not there, but the word begin is coming from the Greek imperfect. It's coming from the grammar of the Greek and not from the word begin in Greek. So it's implied, but it's not from the Greek word begin.
Right.
So that's the case of using italic to let you know that that it's only implied by the Greek. It's not there from the Greek word begin. And other times it's there to smooth it out. Now, by comparison, a lot of translations will use words to smooth stuff out. The NIV, for example, and I don't want to sound like I'm picking on trying to tear down the NIV or any other translation. That's just what a competitor would do, So I'm going to sound biased, I'm probably going to sound biased a lot, I don't know how to avoid that. So I'm just going to have to forgive me for that. But the NIV does that all the time. The difference is the NIV doesn't use any italic or any other, stuff to let you know that they're doing that. So at least we do italic, to let you know when we're adding stuff and or when it's implied, or we're just adding some stuff to smooth out the text a little bit. So I think you know, italic covers some sins, I guess you could say.
Right. I mean, because you're demonstrating still.
Yeah.
Right, because you're still demonstrating that you want to be faithful to what the text says, and to be fair,
Yeah.
even the King James version does not produce italics. For example, the Greek word meganoita is translated as "God forbid," if I'm not mistaken, even though the word "God" is not there
Yeah.
in the original, but it's
Right.
not italicized. But it's basically the strongest no, I guess, back then. So that
Yeah,
would be, but
yeah.
you in the NASB, you would just make that clear to demonstrate that the words that you use to make
Yeah.
a smoother reading of the text.
Yeah, we try to do that. We probably got some places where we could probably use more italic, you know, but we I don't like using italic, you know, but we do, you know, you know, the dangerous thing about italic is, I think, is that it looks like it's emphatic, you know, in a lot of places. So I'm not a fan of italic, but at least it's, you know, as long as you can remember that it's there to let you know when it's covering words that aren't in the Greek and Hebrew, it's I think it's a good thing. So that's why we use it. And also lit notes, the same thing. That's another thing. We might talk about that later, but just to anticipate that, when we have a lit note, we have another guy who's a competitor for the other side who has criticized the term literal and lit notes, you know, let me clear that up. A lit note in the NASB, talking about literal, doesn't mean that that's the only word, the only meaning that a word can have. It just means that in a given passage, the word that we're using, we're trying to let you know, or let the reader know, that in that particular text, that word literally, one of the meanings that it has literally is the word that we're giving in the margin there. Doesn't mean that that word always means literally that. That word that is cited as literal meaning, you know. So we use that word lit loosely. But there again, there's a lot of times when other, and we're kind of, there again, we're covering our bases there, letting people know that we're giving a translation that isn't as literal as it could be, but the literal translation wouldn't make much sense, you know, or it might not make much sense if you're, if we use that particular translation in the text. So we want to be accurate, you know, but sometimes the literal meaning for that particular passage wouldn't make a lot of sense to the reader, you know. So the lit note covers that.
Well, that's interesting. So now, in the context, you've taught a biblical language for more than 20 years, I understand.
Oh, yeah.
And just a common question people get is, why are there so many translations? Isn't the word of God clear enough that you know, we just need one translation? And on top of that, even the NASB is coming up with the NASB 2020. So is that something to do with the word of God not being clear, or and just help our viewers just explain that, please?
Yeah, I was, yeah, there's really, I guess, probably three reasons for that. One is, we've already talked a lot about, is the ancient manuscripts that were discovered since the King James was done, you know, and the textual criticism. Another thing is the looser translations, the thought for thought translations, I would call them. You know, I hate to use the word paraphrasing, because I guess when it comes down to it, there really aren't that many paraphrases. If you think in terms of, technically a paraphrase is when you're not doing translation at all. And that's like the Message. The Message is a classic example of a paraphrase. thought for thought translations are when they're not really trying to match the actual words and grammar up together. And that exploded after the King James came out. We've got all kinds of thought for thought translations out there. I would personally, and a lot of people would be all over me for this, but I would put the NIV in that category. I don't know how they, I think they do consider themselves a thought for thought translation, but they like to argue, some of them like to argue that a thought for thought translation is actually more accurate than a so-called word for word translation. And we're not necessarily a word for word translation, but we're trying to match the the grammar and the meanings of the words as closely as we possibly can. But that's exploded. There are a lot of thought for thought translations out there.
Could you give us an example?
Well, wow. Yeah, I should have prepared for that.
No, that's all right.
I think basically the only two translations that aren't thought for thought translations are the NAS and the ESV right now, the English Standard translation, or English Standard Version, I should say. When you're trying to match up subject, verb, and object, stuff like that, you're still a literal translation, and or relatively literal translation. Boy, I'd almost have to go to like Bible, the Bible Gateway
yes, website.
app?
Yes.
If you go to that and you pick up, select any one version, and NAS, CSV, whatever, and then you just pick out a single verse and then hit all English versions, then what you will see is very close resemblance between usually ESV, NASB, those two. And then you look down the row and you'll see a lot of divergence with all of the other versions, yeah. In terms of word order and stuff like that. Wow. But yeah, I should have. If we, yeah, we'd have to almost take up a verse and look at it and dissect it, And then I could give you an example.
That's all right. So,
wow.
but yeah, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that I should have just given you a simple example. Let's just take one. Maybe John. Anything here. Let me bring up just pick a verse. How about that?
Let's go with John 1:1.
Yeah, I'm bringing up bringing up my Bible program right now, and yeah, let's go to John. Let's just go John 1 here, and I will. Yeah. Or better yet, I'll go to Bible Gateway, and then, okay, my system. All right, okay, let me just bring up, like my clock, if you can hear that.
Right, yeah, I can hear that.
Yeah.
I thought the translation came with music as well, but
Give you a little serenade there. Okay, let's see, Bible Gateway. There we go. John 1. All right. Johnny King. Let's see. Yeah, I'll tell you what, let's look at, all right, I'm looking at John 1, John 1, John born out of the or one of God. All right, yeah. John 1:13. Let's look at John 1:13 Bible Gateway. And all right, so in the NASB, all right, we have, this is a tough one. This is one of the harder verses, and we've got a very literal translation. We're born not of blood nor, yeah, this is a good example. We're born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And I know, try to figure it out. Nobody can. Maybe nobody, not fair to say nobody can, but that would be one I would be tempted to paraphrase for sure. How does the NIV do it?
John 1:13, right?
Yeah, John 1:13. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor of a husband's will, but born of God. You want to know how the Greek has it?
Yep.
The Greek, I shouldn't have closed my program down there. Let me bring up the Greek, or I can do that. I don't really need. Yeah, the Greek.
Yeah. My Greek I have the Greek right here. Yeah.
Yeah, you can. Oh, no wonder. Okay. Yeah, the Greek is literally who, yeah, we're born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So, not of blood, so literally plural, which I think we haven't known, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, of a man, which could be of a husband, but of God. And but children born not of natural descent, nor of a human decision, nor of a husband's will. So you can see that the NIV is well, you can see that they've done some interpretation there. Not of natural, oops. Uh-oh, did I lose you?
Oh, no, I'm still here.
No, I didn't lose you. I just got a different screen there. So, not of natural descent, or not of blood becomes not of natural descent. Will of the flesh. Let's see. Let me go back to my Firefox here. Not of will of the flesh becomes not of human decision. See, not a will of the flesh becomes not of human decision, which is a reasonable interpretation, but that's what it is. Nor of a husband's will. Now that's not bad, because you could argue that man is husband, not of a husband's will, but born of God. Technically, they've repeated, they've moved born down to, let's see, we're born, I don't see born anywhere.
Yeah.
So, born of God, no, that's fine. Born of God is fine.
Yeah.
But so that's fairly interpretive. And the thing about it, we would, if we did something like that, we would have to lit note all that.
Right.
You see? If I go to, let's see, let me find, I'm looking at some other translations here in Bible Gateway. And let me go to a more CSB, not a natural descent nor the will of flesh. Now that's interesting. The CSB, what is that? I forget what that is. But that's who were born not of natural descent nor of the will of the flesh. Looks like they've borrowed from the NIV for that. CEV, not of who were not God's children by nature nor because of human desires. God himself was the one who made them his children. Well, you know, that's nowhere close.
So flesh there is being translated as human desire.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good News Translation, they did not become God's children by natural means, that is, by being born as the children of human father. God himself was their father. Holman Christian Standard, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. That sounds a whole lot like us, like the NASB, which, who was first? We were. Let's see. The LEB, which is a new one, that looks a lot like us again. Let's see here. Born not of human. Bill Mounts, who were born not from human stock, nor from physical impulse. Well, there again, if we did something like that, we would have to lit note that, you know, cover it. And okay, let me come back to you now. So those are some examples. Let me get this out of the way so I can see you again. There we go. And so those are some examples, and that's what I'm talking about. And while we're on that, let me give you an idea of what I would ideally like to see in a reliable translation, like the NASB. Once we cover the stuff we've added with or that we've modified in the text with either a lip note or italic. I would like to see in a literal Bible, and using the word literal in the general sense, like I described, if you give me a Greek and Hebrew expert, put him on an island with a literal Bible and with whatever tools he needs, I would like to see him to be theoretically able to translate that English Bible back into Greek and Hebrew and the Aramaic, where the Aramaic occurs, and see him be able to translate that back in the original languages and come reasonably close now and then to the original text that it was translated from.
Right.
Compare that to the original text. If he gets something close to that, at least in a lot of places, I'm thrilled. I would be thrilled. Okay, and that's what I would hope for. Now, my contention would be that with these other translations, that would not be anywhere near possible. I can't promise it would be possible with the NASB, but I'm hoping that it would be. That's always my goal for it,
Right.
And if the NASB is still readable, and people can make sense of it, and that's what we're always striving for, then we've really accomplished something. So.
Well, that's profound. So what you're saying is that, the way what you would like in a translation, because I think you kind of beat me to my next question. How would you, what advice would you give to someone who is saying, okay, help me out here. What translation should I use? And I think your answer kind of covered that. And you said that the way you would do that is, you throw a Greek scholar on an island. Which one would he be able to translate back closest from the English to the Greek? And that's the way you judge and see who can get back to the original Greek. That's quite profound. I've never thought of it that way before. But it kind of touches on that question, doesn't it? How would I know what's the best translation for me?
Yeah. Wow. That is, a lot of people have asked me that from, over the years. And that is really a hard question.
It's not. You're paid to say it's the NASB, right?
Well, okay. This is why it's a hard question. Okay. All right. It can be a hard question, because how many Bibles are you going to memorize verses from? Okay. Now, if you tell me, if the person who asked me, if that person who asked me says, well, I'm not going to memorize any verses, then I could say, well, it's not such a hard question.
Right.
But, and again, I'll give you a little personal history. My first Bible, since I'm an old geezer, I'm an old guy, my first Bible was a King James, okay? And I memorized some verses from the King James, and I can still, when I remember verses now, my memory is still pretty good. It better be for the work I do. When I remember verses, I still remember, a lot of stuff comes up that's King James wording, and that's a real problem because sometimes it's wrong, when I was in seminary, the New American Standard came out, and I studied under a lot of the men who were leading the work on the NASB, so that became my new Bible, and I try to memorize some verses from that. So the question is, if you probably are going to memorize verses from your Bible, right? Whatever Bible that's going to be. So that's the problem. If you're going to, I'm guessing if you're going to memorize Bible verses, I think most people do, and you're probably not going to memorize Bible verses from a bunch of Bibles. So if you're going to memorize Bible verses, then you're going to want to probably do it, or I would recommend doing it from a reliable Bible, you know. And so if it's, you know, I have to recommend probably from a modern literal Bible, you know, for memorizing verses. Otherwise, you know, if you're going to memorize it from a Bible that isn't reliable, then what's the point? That's a problem. So, yeah, you're right. Then I'm going to end up being biased, you know, because the Bible I'm working on is the only one that I can really vouch for, to be truthful, you know, to be really honest about it. The other one that is out there, the only one I really know about that's modern and I guess relatively reliable is the English Standard Version. It's the only one I know of that is relatively literal. Or I shouldn't say relatively literal. It is a pretty literal Bible. It's got a few issues that I know about, and I'm not going to talk about that on, you know, on the show. If you want to know about that, you can write, you can send me a message on my new Facebook page, and I'll, you know, I'll respond to that. That's only fair. And you might want to look at NASB 2020 if you don't. You might not be comfortable with the wording of the 95 NASB. It's a little dated, you know, probably. So, but that's the real issue. I think the memorization thing, you know. So
it comes down to memorization. Then which one? Because when I since I was young, I know my mom has taught me to memorize Psalms chapter 1, Psalms 23, and even love the Lord thy God. It's not love the Lord your God. So those kind of things, you're taking that into account when you say, think of what will help you in your memorization when you pick a translation. Have I understood you correctly on that?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, what are you comfortable memorizing? And you have to be comfortable with the Bible. That's for sure. Because if you're not comfortable with it, you're just not going to use it, right? So, I mean, I know a lot of people like the thought for thought translations and all that. Probably, if you're not going to be comfortable with a literal Bible, then the NIV is the most popular Bible I think in the world, you know, and it's better than a paraphrase. So I guess if you had to, you probably have to go with the NIV. You know, that's terrible to recommend that from my mouth. You know,
Okay.
if you just couldn't stand the ESV or the NASB, I guess I don't know what else you'd choose, because I certainly wouldn't recommend something like a really loose translation.
A lot of people go with NLT though. And just if you could just briefly share your thoughts. Yeah, a lot of people love that. So I've had my reservations on that. I just want to know what you think.
Well, again, the thing about it, you're going to find out that you can't depend on something like that as a. I mean, some verses, some passages are going to be okay. You know, I saw an interview with Peter Gurry recently, the textual criticism expert, and he made the statement that any Bible at all, even a Bible based on the Textus Receptus, ultimately theology is okay. You know, and I tend to agree with that. I think you know, you're not going to go wrong in your overall theology with any legitimate Bible. You know, they can't screw it up too badly, no matter how badly they screw it up.
Right.
And so some Bible is better than no Bible, you know. And you could probably say that about the NLT, you know. So if you're not going to read, like if you buy a Bible for somebody and it just sits on the shelf and gathers dust, it's worthless, you know. So you have to buy something that is going to be the lowest common denominator that people will use, you know. And thank the Lord for a site like Bible Gateway or something like that, where people can try out different Bibles before they actually buy something, you know, and they can see what they're comfortable with. So, you know, I would certainly recommend a literal Bible to see if they can handle that. But if they can't, yeah, I'd try something, you know, NLT or anything that they can cope with, you know. And I just hope that when it comes to memorizing verses, that they can, you know, use something that is really reliable, you know, in the long run. You know, that doesn't come that something that isn't reliable doesn't become their forever Bible, you know.
Right. Right.
But they need to have something that they are going to use, you know.
That makes sense. Now, we do have a question coming from Michael Lim. Michael Lim is director of Kairos Research Center, and he's also one of the speakers we have in Explain Apologetics. I mean, he also has helped us out in speaking for us on events. Michael Lim, and his question is, how does the average reader who does not know the original language ascertain the correct reading of the text?
Oh boy.
You're at the mercy of the translator, pretty much. It seems like it.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it depends on what they have to work with. They're going to need at least a study Bible with some notes, you know, and a commentary, if you know, if they have that. And hopefully, you know, hopefully they have a pastor who is trained, you know, who can help them out. The thing about it, there were really two issues with alternate readings. There's always two basic issues. One is the age of the manuscripts, and the other is the harder reading issue that we were talking about before. And the harder reading is usually the better reading, usually the more accurate reading. So that's the one that I generally choose over all the others that are available. But if you don't have a Bible that has some notes, you have to find one that does, you know. So I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm giving a very good answer to that question.
Right, but I guess you kind of just said, you know, that in terms of you need a pastor, and at the end of the day to guide you, and but I'm just thinking more in terms of if, let's say, someone, you know, has, like, for example, they come across a verse like you know, the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation but deliver us from evil. Is it evil or is it evil one? How do you answer that question if you don't know the Greek? I guess it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it's even difficult if you do know the Greek. Yeah, and there again, the let's see. Well, there again, a good study Bible should have a note on that. If it doesn't, you have to you either have to have a study Bible with a note that supplies that. If it just has an or note, that's not going to be of any help. It has to say something about the manuscripts, like early. If it says late manuscripts have this reading, you could say, okay, that's not a good reading. You know, you want to go with the early manuscripts, or if it says late manuscripts, it's there out of obligation. It's just there to tell you that okay, we had to add that note so you'd know, but the late manuscripts usually are not reliable. Okay, and a good commentary will tell you that. The trouble is the good commentaries often are hard to come by. They tend to be expensive. So hopefully a good study Bible will say late manuscripts, have this reading, and when you see that, it's just there to let you know that yeah, we had to include that, but that tells you that we've got the better reading in the text.
Right.
So,
and so you did mention get a good study Bible. Now, for those of you watching at home, especially if you're watching it when it premieres 10 a.m. in Malaysian time, well, got news for you. We did have a competition earlier this week, and we put out and basically say a competition, and the winner was actually going to get a study Bible, NASB study Bible, which with a personal note from Dr. Don Wilkins himself. We'll get to the announcement of who that is later, just before we close. We do have one more question before we wrap up. And that question, Dr. Wilkins, is this. Do share with us just two things, basically. One question divided into two parts. Do share with us what are some of the major like difficulties or challenges you faced in translating the NASB, and this could be whether it's the 95 NASB or whether it's the 2020 to come. And also do tell us a little bit about the NASB 2020 and your book, which will be coming out, I presume, later this year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, yeah, we've had a couple of things. One is for some of the challenges. One, I could mention several. One was the challenge of improving the readability without losing accuracy. Here again, some of the competitors that we've had, I get tired of seeing competitors saying we're more readable than the NASB and just as accurate or even more accurate. And some of the examples we referred to earlier when we were looking at John 1:13, you saw how they kind of almost paraphrase some of the language, and how difficult it was to do that. Well, we could have changed some of the wording and maybe added a bunch of lit notes, but I hate, you can put all these lit notes in there, and before you know it, you've got this margin full of lit notes, which gets kind of cumbersome. And then, maybe not every Bible you want to put out, like Pew Bibles, for example, you can't necessarily have lit notes in every single edition you publish, and then you've got suddenly the translation changes for some people. So it's always, you're always kind of walking a tightrope between how much you change the text and how accurate it stays. So for the NASB, the challenge is to how much you improve the readability without losing accuracy, and that's a challenge. We want to make it as readable as possible, but accuracy has to stay up there too. So it's like we don't want to, we want to keep here's accuracy here, and here's readability here. And we don't want to improve accuracy this much and lose this much. I mean, we don't want to improve readability this much, 5% maybe, and lose 30% accuracy. And the guys and the competitors say, oh, we're way more readable than the NASB and just as accurate. Well, that doesn't happen. You can't improve readability this much and maintain accuracy like that. It just doesn't happen. It's like in John 1:13, you can't make those kinds of changes, you know, and then go off on a desert island and back translate it and guess what the original was from some of these major changes like that. You just can't do that. So that's a constant struggle to improve the readability, that. Another challenge was, and this was going to sound crazy, but there are some old words, and we encountered this both with the 95 edition and with the 2020 edition too. There's some old words in there that are surprisingly hard to change and to replace. One of them was behold. You would think that behold is an easy word to replace, all right? But some words are hard to put in the mouth of a first century person, you know, first century AD person. Now, if I want to say behold today, it's hard to find places where I can use it. Behold, you know? Well, that sounds fine from a pastor behind a pulpit, but I don't go, you know, outside and talk to my wife or my daughter or my friend and say, well, we were looking and we saw this accident, and behold, a guy runs into a lamppost. We don't talk that way. I'd say, well, look, you know, but then a first century guy, I don't think he said, well, I went out there and, hey, look. I didn't say a guy. Couldn't quite imagine a guy doing that in the first century, or hey, look out, you know. I didn't see Paul or Peter saying, look out over there, a fish. I don't think we didn't change the beholds in the 2020 edition. So we really couldn't find a good thing to replace. We did change the word lest. We took that out. I think we took that out of the 95 edition. And then I've gotten used to watching a lot of TV. I've got a good excuse for watching a lot of television, because that's how I kind of gauge as to what old words are still being used. And so every time I see a guy say lest on the news or something like that, I cringe. I get a bad feeling in my gut, because I think, oh no, is that a word we should have kept? Or are we still using lest these days? But it turns out to be a false positive, because usually when somebody uses lest these days, it turns out they're kind of using it in a kind of comic book fashion. They're not really serious when they use lest. They just say it in sort of a funny way. Like they really wouldn't, you still really wouldn't go out and say lest in an everyday way. You'd only say that in certain special situations where you're kind of using it in kind of an offhand, joking way, you know.
Lest help me God, you know. So some people would say that, yeah. Yeah,
and so it's tricky, you know. Another word that I think we did finally replace for the 2020 edition was alas. But that was really hard to replace. I think we replaced it with or o or something like that. I'm not sure, but unfortunately, I think the only words we really use every day now for alas are 4-letter words, you know, bad words.
Right.
So So that's been a huge challenge, replacing some old words and finding the right words to switch with, you know. So there's a couple of, another big challenge has been gender words. And we're still grappling with that, how to deal with the gender exclusive words. I think we're not doing some of the things that some of the other translations are doing, but we're still dealing with that, you know. So yeah, the challenges are still coming, and we're trying to with 2020. We're not just dealing with the year 2020, but we're looking beyond for years to come, because a new revision has to cover like 10 or 15 years, you know, into the future.
Right.
So I forgot there was another part of the question, I think.
Your book, mainly your book, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's the sorry, that's a book on the concordance-based genealogical system that I'm working on, and hopefully get that out in a few months. And yeah, there Peter Gurry and Tommy Wasserman did a or no, I think well, yeah, I think they both did a book on that already, and they are their field is textual criticism. I'm doing it kind of as a translator, and I hope to give a different perspective on that, because I think translators have to deal with that, as I said earlier too. But that's a yeah, that's really bringing a different perspective to textual criticism, and I think that's something that pastors have to take that into account where they have the time, because it's going to affect the Nestle Allen text. There are basically, when it comes down to it, there are two Greek texts out there that people translate from, the Nestle Allen text and the majority text, which is you can still make out the majority text from the Nestle text, but the New King James version was done from the majority text primarily, and all the other translations, all the other modern translations are done from the Nestle text. Basically, there are a couple of other competing Greek texts out there that are trying to make inroads into the Nestle text, but I don't think they're really going to have much of an impact. I think the Nestle text will remain the main text for translation into the foreseeable future, and the the CBGM for short, the coherence-based genealogical method, is going to have a major impact on all future work, and it can have a very steep learning curve if you really get into it. It has online tools that anybody can access, you know, but it takes some time and effort to get into it. I think for pastors, it's going to be pretty daunting. It's going to be pretty tough, because pastors don't have a lot of time to spend on textual criticism, and even less for something like this, I think. And I think they need all the help they can get. So I'm going to try to, in my book, I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. But for Bible students and for people who want to get into it more deeply, you know, maybe even for seminary professors. And I did teach in seminary for a while. I hope to give a different perspective to this from a translator's viewpoint that can hopefully, kind of break it down and show some of the problems with it and also the strengths of it, and hopefully simplify it as much as possible and show how it has some. I think it does have some benefits and show how I used it in working with it for the for NASB 2020. So hopefully it'll be helpful. In some ways, it's very simple mathematically. The way it's constructed, it's very simple. So I don't think it needs to be a too great a challenge for people who really want to dig into it a bit. But I appreciate you mentioning that.
Certainly, and at Explain Apologetics, we will definitely, as soon as we get news that Dr. Don Wilkins' book is published, we'll have that posted on our Facebook page so that you can know not just when the book is published, but how you can get a copy of one as well. And with that, I think we've hit the last question of this discussion. We've hoped those of you back home have enjoyed listening to an insight on what goes on behind the scenes and basically how your translation that you have in your homes gets made. Before we end, though, we did promise we would announce the winner for that competition. I'd like to give Dr. Don Wilkins the chance to announce that winner. Go ahead, Dr. Don Wilkins.
Yes, the winner is Mr. Wilson Moy, and I'm delighted to be able to announce that, and I will be sending Wilson a personal note. Hope that this study Bible will be of great service to him, and my very great thanks to him for participating in this contest.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
And my thanks to you for allowing me to participate in this interview. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, the joy has been all ours, and it's been a thorough privilege just to hear from you what goes on. And I hope for those of us watching at home, those of you watching at home, that this would actually be whet your appetite to fall in love with Scripture and to basically read God's Word, because what you and I have in our hands today is something that people back in the day, especially in the 3rd and the 4th century, it was a privilege unimaginable. And even to the later period of time as well, not everyone had the luxury of being able to hold the Word of God in the comfort of your own homes. And if you can do that today, you are privileged. Count your blessings, read the Word of God. Once again, tremendous joy and pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Don Wilkins. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm Samuel Nesan. Hope you've enjoyed this. If you haven't quite subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, you can do that. No compulsion whatsoever, but just a suggestion. And if you found this video helpful, please share them to your friends as well. And in that way, pass the blessings around. Until we meet again next time, hope this has been a blessing. Bye for now.